Hello, I'm Canon Jeff Hopewell, a retired priest in the Church of England, and I shall be talking about the stained glass of Douglas Hamilton and the Stephen Adams studio, with particular reference to the churches in Kirkintilloch. As you will immediately gather from my accent, I'm not exactly local. I live south of the border, in Leicestershire in the East Midlands. So how, you may wonder, did I get interested in Douglas Hamilton when none of his windows have been found in England? Well, those of you who watch Bargain Hunt at lunchtime will have heard of the Newark Antiques Fair in my next door county of Nottinghamshire. It was there some 20 years ago that I bought from a Scottish antique dealer half a dozen full-size working drawings for stained glass windows, known as cartoons, by a variety of artists. And here are two of them. They don't look much on the screen, but they're actually 12 foot 8 inches long by 19 3/4 inches wide. The church windows for which the glass was made are more like 25 foot high, so these are just the main figures, with smaller symbols above and below. On the left is the angel of the agony who appeared to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and on the right is the Archangel Michael. I've included close-ups of the faces, so you can perhaps see why I was struck by these drawings. The central figure in the window is of the risen Christ, but I have no idea if that cartoon still exists. The designs are clearly labelled Douglas Hamilton, 338 St Vincent Street, Glasgow, and Shawlands Old Parish Church, Glasgow. The glass is still in the church, but the building now belongs to the Destiny Church. Hamilton rarely signed his work, which has not made the task of tracking down the 85 or more churches which have his glass very easy. Or indeed, not all the windows, nor indeed all of those churches have actually survived. But fortunately, he did sign his cartoons. He's usually thought of as a Glasgow man, but he wasn't born in the city. Indeed, he wasn't even born in Scotland. He was actually born thousands of miles away in India, in a garrison town called Shah Jahanpur in the state of Rajasthan. This is where his father, James Hamilton, was stationed. He was a colour sergeant in the 1st Cameronians, Scottish Rifles, and he and his wife Jeannie had come out of India about a year before Douglas was born, on the 22nd of October, 1895. But sadly, Jeannie died of acute meningitis in 1897 when Douglas was not even 2 years old. At some stage during the next few years, he and his older sister Frances were sent back to Scotland to live with Jeannie's sister and her husband in Glasgow. We know nothing of Hamilton's early schooling, but when older, he did attend Provençside higher grade school. The usual age for leaving school at that time was 14, as provided by the 1901 Education Act, so we can assume that that will be in the autumn of 1909. It's more than likely that he started his career in stained glass immediately. Certainly, by the time of the census in 1911, he is recorded as an apprentice glass stainer. A reference to Hamilton's early career is found in his obituary, which records that he served his articles with the late Stephen Adam, Glasgow, a leading stained glass artist of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. Although there were two Stephen Adams, father and son, this would seem to indicate that he trained under the father, but we can't be absolutely sure. And this is the father's name and address on a window depicting St John in the church at Kilmun, not that far from Dunoon. And here are some further photos of it. Here we have St John himself, the full window, and then faith, hope, and love, right at the top of the window, and then a close-up of the face. Stephen Adam Jr. became a partner in his father's business in 1896, which was renamed Stephen Adam and Son. For some unspecified reason, the two of them fell out, and the partnership was dissolved in 1904, with the younger man setting up in opposition just across the road from his father. And here are two of his windows that are now in the Church of St. James the Less, bishoprics. They are, I would say, equally accomplished. The first is of Christ as a man of sorrows, and the second is a detail of Christ and the little children. It was around the time of the disagreement that the older man took on Alf Webster, who made such a mark that he was taken into partnership in 1909. Stephen Adams Sr. died in the August of 1910, leaving Alf Webster in charge of his studio. On the demise of his father, the younger Stephen Adam immediately dropped the description of junior from his business title, probably in an attempt to divert business away from his late father's firm. This resulted in a lawsuit between Webster, who carried on the Stephen Adams studio at 168 Bath Street, and Stephen Adam, whose premises were at 105 Bath Street. In the end, the matter of who was entitled to use the Stephen Adam name was settled out of court. Alf Webster's business flourished, but Stephen Adams seems to have declined, and in 1916 he emigrated to the United States. Alf Webster is generally recognised as the greatest Scottish stained glass designer and maker of his day. And here are three details from a window of the risen Christ at Cathcart Trinity in Glasgow. Notice the rather lovely procession of angels around the hem of Christ's robe and the brilliant white of the end of the girdle. And when you look from the side, you can see how prominent those pieces of glass actually are. Another of Webster's window. This is King David, again from Kilmun. And those of you who are familiar with the stained glass in St. David's Memorial Park Church in Kirkintilloch will notice that there is a distinct resemblance between the Kilmun window of 1912 and the King David window that was given by the youth of St. David's when the church was built in 1926. The latter is also the work of the Stephen Adams studio, and the upper part of David's body, notably the head and hands, are copied from the 1912 original. The reuse of designs was, of course, common practice. Although Stephen Adam was still alive when Hamilton joined the firm, he was not a well man, and it's unlikely that he had much to do with Hamilton's training. The prime influence on him was undoubtedly Alf Webster. And you'll notice in this detail, in particular, the patterns on the individual diamond panes, especially that sort of triangular pattern underneath the inscription. You will see this sort of thing in some of the later work of the Stephen Adams studio, the work of Gordon Webster, and the early work of Hamilton himself. When Hamilton was almost 18, he registered at the Glasgow School of Art for the academic year 1913-14. Only people of private means could afford to be full-time students. Working folk could only spare the time for evening classes. He enrolled for a second academic year, 1914-15, but scarcely attended the course. This is quite understandable, as on the 21st of November 1914, he enlisted as a private in the 7th Battalion of the Scottish Rifles, also known as the Cameronians. This was, of course, his father's old regiment. They remained in Scotland for the first 6 months, but on the 23rd of May 1915, the battalion set off for war. His baptism of fire came when he landed at Gallipoli on the 14th of June 1915. Both the 7th and the 8th Battalion sustained such losses that within a fortnight the two were merged. They remained at the Cape Helles bridgehead until being withdrawn at the end of the year. Hamilton landed at Alexandria in Egypt in January 1916, and his battalion stayed in the Middle East for a further 2 years. Early in August 1916, he applied for a commission, but it wasn't until April 1917 that he boarded ship to return to United Kingdom for training. He finally got his commission as second lieutenant on the 27th of November. He spent the next 5 months with the 5th Battalion, sailing from Folkestone at the end of April 1918 to join the 9th Battalion in Flanders on the 4th of May. Here is a detail of soldiers in the trenches from a war memorial window of 1921, attributed to the Stephen Adams Studio. It's in St John's Cooper, Fife. If you're familiar with the stained glass in Caddo Parish Church, Bishopriggs, you will see there a similar scene by the firm, though in that window the troops are shown going over the top. There were several months of heavy fighting, and the battalion was withdrawn for rest late in October. It was still in billets when the armistice was declared on the 11th of November. He had survived the war pretty well intact, physically at any rate. Hamilton transferred to the 28th Trench Mortar Battery and volunteered to serve with the Army of Occupation. He was promoted to lieutenant at the end of May 1919 and demobbed in October. After nearly 5 years in the Army, it was back to civilian life for Douglas Hamilton. Did he come back to a land fit for heroes? This photo of Hamilton in his 20s comes from the Webster family archive. Well, the term had already started at Glasgow School of Art, but he joined the course a bit late and did a further 2 years of evening classes there. As far as we can tell, he went back to his old job, but much had happened in the 5 years he had been away. Alf Webster, his boss, had enlisted in the Gordon Highlanders at the end of February 1915 and received a commission as second lieutenant. In May 1915, he joined the 1st Battalion in Flanders and was severely wounded on the 28th of August at Étaples, just outside Le Touquet. He was buried at the nearby military cemetery at only 31 years of age. A sad end to a brilliant artist and craftsman in stained glass. Curiously enough, John Lauder, son of the famous Scottish entertainer Sir Harry Lauder, was in the same hospital, though nothing like as badly injured. And as he was playing the piano, Alf Webster asked him if he would play the hymn, Lead, Kindly Light. He did so, and Alf died an hour later. And John Lauder was also killed in action the following year. This scene of grieving parents at the graveside is also from that war memorial window at St John's Cooper. After Alf's death, his widow Maud was left to continue the business and care for her 3 sons, Martin, aged 13, Gordon, aged 7, and Comyn, who was not even a year old. Obviously, she would have been unable to run the firm on her own, and she relied on the experienced staff, commissioning other artists, notably Alexander Walker, for design work, though, as I've already mentioned, the reuse of existing designs was common practice in those days. This is the upper part of the War Memorial window at Rothesay High Kirk, now known as the United Church of Bute. And this is the lower part. It was designed by Walker and shows the risen Christ above a deserted scene of destruction, complete with howitzer and tank. The window is dedicated on the 4th of January 1920, so it might already have been started by the time Hamilton rejoined the firm. You'll notice the names of various campaigns in the scrolls around the border, including Gallipoli on the left, which must have brought back a few memories for Hamilton. It's sometimes implied that he headed up the workshop in his return to work. Although he was almost certainly in charge at a later stage, it's highly improbable that after 5 years away from the craft, he would be given that sort of responsibility immediately. Besides which, there were already competent people around who'd been running the business in the 4 years since Alf Webster's death. As time went on, Alf's sons got more and more involved in the business. As early as 1920, a newspaper report recorded that a window installed in the Paisley Church was designed by Mr. M.C. Webster of the Stephen Adams Studios. Not a bad achievement for an 18-year-old, if the report is accurate, which I doubt. However, he was happy to give the impression that he was in charge, and here is his inscription on the window that will be familiar to you, the Te Deum window at St Mary Kirkintilloch of 1926. And here is the window itself. As you can see, it's pretty big. Indeed, although I haven't undertaken quite as much research on the Stephen Adams studio as on Hamilton himself, I think it's probably the largest that they ever tackled. We'll go on to the details in a bit, but briefly, in the rose element at the top are the symbols of the Holy Trinity, and they're surrounded by angel faces. The top row of figures are 4 angels flanking Christ in majesty. The middle rank shows Christ on the cross, flanked by saints, and the lower rank, the Virgin and Child, and around her are people representing the arts, professions, and trades, various crafts as well. I called it the Te Deum window because it depicts the worship of God by a wide variety of heavenly and human figures. But the inscription, which is beautifully worded, says, "In memory of those who served, in sympathy with those who suffered, and in grateful remembrance of those who gave their lives in the Great War, 1914-1918. Let's have a quick change of slide. This is Christ in majesty. There's a very lengthy and immensely helpful article in the Kirkintilloch Herald of the 23rd of June 1926 concerning this window and its dedication ceremony. It tells us that the late Mr. Alfred A. Webster designed the window and soon after responded to the call of king and country and made the supreme sacrifice. As I mentioned earlier, Alfred Webster joined up in February 1915 and died that same August. We have no reason to doubt that he did design it. That would have been well over 11 years prior to the window's manufacture and installation. And undoubtedly, someone else was responsible for the full-scale detail. And it seems rather unlikely that it was intended as a war memorial from the start. One of the representative figures is a soldier. Now, he may have been part of the original design, but it's more than likely that he was introduced at a later date. The newspaper also tells us that Mrs. Webster wisely kept the well-skilled staff of the Stephen Adams studio together until her sons were able to take over the business. Martin was by this time aged 24 and Gordon 18. Hamilton isn't mentioned by name as one of the staff, and although there is circumstantial evidence that he was, there is very little in the way of firm documentary proof. Once again, the Kirkintilloch Herald comes to the rescue. When reporting the dedication of the Morrison Memorial window in 1954, it tells us that Hamilton was responsible for the chancel window, presumably in his capacity as foreman. Now, the Reverend T. Angus Morrison is commemorated in that window by Hamilton, that we'll come on to later, but apparently we can see him in this window. The standing figure on the left is St. Ninian, with the Church of St. Mary Kirkintilloch at his feet and under his protection. The saint's features are, I'm told, those of the minister himself. We'll come back to this window later, as it had a particular influence on one of Hamilton's earliest windows. It's probably fair to say that Martin Webster's heart was not fully in the business, and in the late 1920s, his theatrical interests took him to London, where he became a producer of BBC radio programmes. Gordon, who had felt called to make stained glass from an early age, gradually took over the reins of the business. Here is his window of 1928, in memory of Sir Harry Lauder's wife and his son John at St. John's Dunoon. Gordon Webster's coming of age probably created a dilemma for Hamilton. One gets the impression that Gordon did not value his older employee, and possibly even mentor, very highly. Let's go to a close-up of this window. Once again, you can see the very decorative dun panes known as quarries. Gordon's increasing need to spread his wings may well have prompted Hamilton to move on. This window is signed by Gordon. Stephen Adams Studios. That sometimes you get Stephen Adams Studios, sometimes Studios. I don't think it makes much difference. But Hamilton moved on. An opportunity arose at the long-established and highly regarded firm of Guthrie and Wells in January 1929. The glory days of that firm were long in the past, and very few church commissioners came in during the time Hamilton was there. Whilst it's impossible to say whether or not Hamilton designed any of the Stephen Adams windows, we can be certain that he designed at least one of the Guthrie and Wells windows. This window depicts the virtuous wife and the sower, and it's in memory of the Reverend James Cooley and his wife at Pencaitland Parish Church, East Lothian. It dates from 1929, and you will see a distinct similarity in the figure of the sower with that in the window made by Hamilton himself for Sandbank Church near Dunoon 10 years later. You see that the sower is reversed, otherwise practically identical. We don't know why. It may have been the shortage of orders coming in, but Douglas Hamilton left Guthrie and Wells at the end of September 1938 to set up his own business. In retrospect, not perhaps the most propitious time to launch out on your own. The first window he made, or at least the first I've been able to identify, was for Cathcart's South Church, Glasgow, and it was dedicated on the 5th of March 1939. Here you'll see Jesus taking a little child and explaining to the disciples that they too should be like little children. This is in what a friend of mine calls Hamilton's Edwardian style. And as you'll see, his post-war style was somewhat different. Rather attractive angel, again with these very decorative quarters. And Hamilton signed this. Obviously, he was very proud of this one. He completed 2 further commissions in the following months for Dunoon High Kirk and the nearby church of Sandbank, part of which window you've already seen. This is his major work of the period. It's at Hindland Parish Church, Glasgow, and it's on the theme of service, dedicated on the 29th of October, 1939. It shows Christ in majesty, flanked by angels and worshipped by people from various sectors of society. At the time it was commissioned, the minister there commented to his Kirk session that he was sure that they would agree with him, that it was a particularly beautiful design, and that the young artist who had designed it would go far in the future. Must be nice to be called a young artist when you're nearly 44. As you may already have noticed, this window bears a certain resemblance to the window at St Mary by the Stephen Adams Studio. On the left is the Angel of the Agony from Kirkintilloch, and on the right, the Hindland version. Again, on the left from Kirkintilloch, men representing the judiciary, theology, and literature. And on the right from Hindland, the judiciary, industry, and theology. Obviously, things had moved on a little bit since 1926 because theology here is represented by a woman, but she has the same globe beside her, denoting the worldwide mission of the church. The Glasgow landmarks are clearer in the Hindland window than they are in the Kirkintilloch, and you will know better than I which institutions they are. Here's another comparison. The bearded artist at Hindland in particular bears a very close relationship to the one at Kirkintilloch. Hamilton made a further couple of windows in November and December, and another early in 1940, but as far as I can tell, no more until after the end of hostilities. In the latter stages of the war, he was already getting publicity for himself, advertising the Church of Scotland yearbook. He also exhibited 2 designs for memorial stained glass windows at the Royal Glasgow Institute of the Fine Arts, each year from 1944 to 1946, and 2 photographs in 1947. He exhibited in later years as well. Hamilton's first post-war window was to be dedicated at Grahamston Parish Church, Falkirk, on the 1st September 1946. This was a pre-war project, and the full-size drawings of the window, in memory of the Reverend Andrew Ross Taylor, had been displayed to the congregation in December 1939. The simplicity of the window may be due to the fact there was only £100 available to pay for it. I didn't actually realise that this window existed until I went into the church to look for the Hamilton's War Memorial window of 1950, which I did know about already. Here is that window, with St Andrew on the right and King David on the left. Actually, the War Memorial is a brass plaque with all the names of those who were killed. The window itself is in thanksgiving for the many who returned from service. Quite a few of Hamilton's windows were war memorials, but memorials to individuals also made up quite a large part of his work, and especially those commemorating ministers. The Reverend William White was minister of Crosshouse Parish Church in Ayrshire, and the brother of the very Reverend Dr. John White, former moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. This window was dedicated in 1948, as you can see, very different from the Hindland window, and certainly from the cathedral. Contemporary press report states that the window has two lights, and the biblical subjects in them are typical of the man and his ministry. Two Old Testament figures appear in the left light, Moses and Amos, to underline William White's leadership and adherence to God's law and his concern for the poor. In the right, a vignette depicts Peter shamefacedly allowing Jesus to wash his feet, though the virtue it's probably intended to highlight is that of service. The larger image on the right is of the women at the empty tomb and the risen Christ, emphasizing the Christian belief in the resurrection and the hope of heaven. You will have noticed from the previous slide Hamilton's liking for pink, which is even more in evidence here. And you'll see how much he has left his Edwardian period behind. In an almost cartoon style, Amos leaps out at the viewer, remonstrating at the plight of the poor. And here, Peter's expression speaks volumes. And this pair of windows, the ones you'll recognise, erected in St Mary's Parish Church, Kirkintilloch, commemorating the Reverend T. Angus Morrison. He was minister there for no less than 48 years and was responsible for the building of the new church. He was also a noted Freemason and provincial Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Dunbartonshire. It comprises a pair of two light windows in that cross house, with the Old Testament figures on the left and a New Testament on the right. The main figures on the left are Ezra and Nehemiah, prophets connected with the rebuilding of the temple and of the walls of Jerusalem after the exile, and also two craftsmen, Belaziel and Malchiah, Solomon, builder of the first temple, and Moses also appear in the window. The windows on the right are of Christ the carpenter and Christ the king, depicted with more than a hint of Christ the high priest. Also the Holy Spirit embracing Kirkintilloch Church, the Lamb standing on the book with 7 seals from the book of Revelation, St Andrew and St Paul. And here is the Lamb, rather nice sort of nursery, cuddly sort of lamb. It bears a standard, therefore a symbol of the resurrection. Usually, the device on the standard is a red cross on a white background, but here it is white on a green background, the colours of the Grand Lodge. The windows were dedicated on the 11th of April 1954, and during the course of the sermon, the Reverend Dr. John Conn, who had been an assistant minister of the church, made reference to the importance of symbol. T. Angus Morrison revelled in ritual. Rituals are among the most important elements in any religion. Religious ritual is shared symbolic action expressive of common strivings rooted in common values. Elaborate rituals and symbols of Freemasonry, with its insignia and signs, had a tremendous fascination for our friend and brother. Morrison had an insatiable appetite for symbol. Symbols are expressions of the soul's experience. They determined Morrison's interests and gave meaning to his ministry. There could be no more appropriate memorial to his life and work, both here and elsewhere, than this window, whose symbolism is akin to his own conception of things. Stone and wood, mason and carpenter, life and work, a holy vocation, stemming from the cross of Christ, Lord and King. Our time together is drawing to a close, but there's something else that attracts me to Hamilton's work, and that is the depictions of everyday life that you will find in some of his windows. And this is part of a war memorial at Blackridge, East Lothian. And here are soldiers, as you might expect. It is, after all, a war memorial window. It also bears one of Hamilton's rare signatures, Douglas Hamilton, Glasgow. But it was not just those who fought who were involved in the war effort. Here is a miner, and Blackridge was in the mining district, and a ploughman. And here is a quarryman, an engineer, and a housewife. Though considering it's wartime, the shop does look suspiciously well stocked. Here we have Boy Scouts camping at Westkirk, Arbroath. And here are the Girl Guides. Finally, I'll round off with a few details from the huge windows at Wellpark Midkirk, Greenock, which were paid for by compensation received in respect of war damage when which the church suffered during the Blitz. And here are some vignettes of the local industries. Shipbuilding. You almost feel the heat coming from the furnace. Sugar refining and barrel making. And the arts, poetry and literature. I love the discarded papers on the floor as the author searches for inspiration. I'm sure Hamilton was really enjoying himself with these. Here we have painting and sculpture. And from the look of it, the sculpture was destined for Easter Island. The church retains all the documentation for the windows, and on the final receipt, Hamilton says that he hopes they still give pleasure, as they were a joy to make. I hope you'll agree that Hamilton's windows still give pleasure to us many years later. Hamilton died in 1959, aged 63, and he was buried on the Isle of Arran, where he and his wife had a cottage, which was intended for his planned retirement later that year. As far as I know, there is no stained glass in his memory, just this gravestone. All that remains for me to do is to thank you for listening, bid you farewell, and say that if this talk has whetted your appetite and you wish to know more, there is no better way of finding out than by buying a copy of this book at the modest price of £19.95, UK postage included, and email me at coplopress@gmail.com for further details. Bye.